The journey is conversations with ordinary people about stories of transformation and how we may have had setbacks in our life and how we persevered through those, how we've learned from those obstacles, and how they've, maybe helped us on our path today. So, Christina Warden, welcome to the journey. And so let me just first start off with just saying what the journey is about. And the journey is a show that talks about stories of transformation, how individuals may have gone through a difficult time and transformed their lives, either failed forward, some kind of setback that they may have had in their life, um, or maybe they transformed through a change in a career, or had something happen where they brought their career to another level, brought their life to a different level, something along that line. Um, so welcome to the journey. And I know we've known each other now for, I'm thinking 5 or 6 years, and maybe even a little bit longer. How many
Yep,
years? 7
it's
years?
7.
7 years. Okay. And so you, during your journey, we'll get into that in a little bit, your own journey, but why don't you tell us a little bit first, for our listeners, what does Christina do for fun?
I love hanging out with my family. I love being with my kids. I love doing things with my family and enjoying time with my husband and my 4 children. And probably the best time we have is when we don't have anything to do and we can have a movie night or play a board game. There's times when my husband still wrestles with my children and even the bigger ones, and it gets pretty rowdy.
Hmm.
And so I love to just kind of sit back and watch because I know that those days are numbered. So I really enjoy just being with my family. Yeah.
Okay. Well, why don't you do that? Why don't you tell us a little bit about your family? Your husband's Gary, right? And you guys have been together for how long?
This year we're married 19 years together. This will be 22 years this year.
Oh, all right, cool.
Yeah,
Congratulations. And
thank
then
you.
and then you have a whole herd of kids. So why don't you go down the the breakdown of the kids?
I have Riley. She's 15,
Okay.
and she's a sophomore. I have Fiona, who's 13. She's in 7th grade. And then I have Campbell, who is 10, and he's in 4th grade. And then Ember, who is 5. She just turned 5 in February.
And Ember's pretty, and
Lovely.
not that, and not that the other ones aren't special, but Ember is a little bit special around KP because I think you had only been with us for about a year and a half, or maybe
Yes.
2 years,
Yeah.
and or actually a year or so,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and then announced to me that you were pregnant, and we went through that journey.
Yeah.
So
I think she was the first KP baby, wasn't
I.
she?
Uh,
Maybe.
at least from the standpoint at the Linden building, that's for sure. For
Yeah.
first KP baby at the Linden building.
Yeah.
So, um, so with your kids, I know that they're pretty involved with sports, right? And you're pretty active with that. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. So from the very beginning, Gary and I both were athletes in school, and we learned very early on how important athletics became to us, and it was almost an outlet for us, but also very therapeutic for us as well, and it kept us fit and healthy and happy, and so right away we knew we wanted to try to get our kids involved into sports just because of all the different reasons, all the different benefits. And, we didn't have any idea about how it would take off. And Riley really sort of spearheaded the field for them. And she was the trailblazer. She started off in gymnastics very early. We could tell that there was some gifts there for sure that she was blessed with. And then her and her sister wound up competing in gymnastics for USAG. And Riley finished, she retired with 12 years in, and Fiona retired with, I think, 10 years in.
Okay, all right. And I know that just having my own kids involved with the arts as well as athletics, it's pretty time consuming, and at times can be a costly. endeavor, but I
Yes,
agree with you.
yes.
It's
Yes.
very much worth it.
Yes, club sports have been a blessing to us. I mean, we really saw, even with, they've now stemmed into volleyball and soccer. Fiona plays soccer, Riley plays volleyball, and then Riley does track and field, and she loves pole vaulting. She's done very well with that. And then Fiona has also attempted track, but more or less loves volleyball and soccer.
Okay.
And then Campbell, my son, is in four sports. He actually became a black belt in his dojo in karate when he was 8 years old.
Mm.
And so from then on, it just, it went everywhere. And so he plays basketball, baseball, and soccer as well.
Nice.
And now little Ember is enjoying, we had her in dance and tumbling. So with everything going on right now, they're not doing anything but trying to work out at home. So we're getting as creative as we can be.
Sure, sure. Well, and I know that that is definitely a lot of families right now of trying to figure out how their athletes, let alone their students, are able to keep up with their schoolwork and continue their learning, but how the athletes are continue to try to stay in shape and continue to develop their skills, and they don't have direct contact with their coaches. And sometimes they have some indirect, through Zoom or through whatever it may be. But so before we start getting into your story a little bit, Christina, are you from the Rockford area or
No,
growing up? Or?
no, I'm originally born and raised in Bolingbrook, Illinois,
Oh, okay.
and so outside of Chicago there. And then shortly after that, we moved around quite a bit. So we moved from there to Las Vegas, and then we moved to Arizona, and then we moved to California, and then we moved to Indiana. And you might think I'm a military brat, but that's
Yeah,
not the case.
yeah,
We were nomads. No, I'm just joking.
yeah.
My family liked to move around a lot. We were trying to find our home, and my mom and my stepdad, they both worked in casinos, and so I actually got the great experience of being raised right off of a reservation for a time in Iowa, and it was wonderful. And so I wouldn't give that up for anything. But I grew up pretty much everywhere,
Okay.
all over the place. And then when I landed here, um, was going to live with my sister for a while after high school and go to NIU, and I wound up going to Rockford College.
Oh, okay. And when you were at Rockford, Rockford, it was Rockford College at the time,
It
and
was
now it's
not
Rockford
Rockford
University.
University. Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. What did you study when you were there?
I studied sociology and anthropology, and then I did a pre-social work emphasis.
Gotcha.
And I loved every minute of it.
Okay.
And then decided from then on that I wanted to do social work. I had a volunteer position that I worked at. I had two actually, and one of them was the Big Brothers Big Sisters. So I was
Mm.
a big sister for several years, and still love my little sister today. So close with her. She's wonderful. She just retired from the Navy, and so she's doing great. And then I also volunteered for an organization that's still present today, uh, Rockford Sexual Assault Counseling Center. So I
Okay.
was a volunteer advocate for them for a long time, and that was a wonderful experience. So I knew I wanted to work in social work, so I stayed in the area. And then I met a boy. And
Yeah. And they end up making you stick around and things like that.
yeah,
Yeah,
that
exactly.
helped. Yes.
So were those volunteer positions, were those something that like how did they come about? Were they like were they school driven, or were they how did that all come to be?
No, honestly, it was inherent. When I was about 18, 19 years old, I knew that I wanted to work with people. But I thought initially that I was going to do police and fire. And
Okay.
so when I was, I think I had to be 21. When I first turned the legal age, maybe it was 20, I can't remember now, I went and tested for the Belvedere Fire Department. And I got on the list, and I was waiting for my name to be called. And I was very low because I was the only woman out of 75 people that showed up that day. So that was pretty interesting. And I made it, which was great. But I was waiting for my name to be called, working a couple waitressing jobs. And I found this opportunity to do this volunteer work, and so I wound up volunteering and doing it for quite a while, and just falling in love with it. And someone said, you could do counseling, you could do social work, you could work with people in the community. And then I learned a little bit about what that was, and that's what spearheaded that for me.
Gotcha. If there was one thing from your experience with the big brother, big sister, what was like one thing and I know there's probably many things, but what was one thing you took away from that experience? Because they do such a great job. So what was one thing you took away from that experience?
What I really took away was that, oftentimes when you enter into a program like that, you think that you're taking the place of a parent who's absent. And in my situation, she had a very present mother. Her mom was completely present in her life and loving and compassionate and giving, but she worked a lot. And I think she wanted her daughter to enjoy fun and have space in her life so that it wasn't always filled with, going to and fro and having to worry about paying bills and responsibilities, but just having someone come and take her and just focus on her and be there for her. And so for me, what I learned most is that you're not always going there to provide a place or a space for someone because there's a parent who's absent. You're doing it um, simply as a bonus at times. I know I understand that sometimes that happens where there's an absent parent, but in my case, it wasn't about that at all.
Well, it sounds like your I guess little sister in this case, right? Um, his mom was pretty wise that
Yeah.
she was able to see that and be able to um, uh, be courageous enough as well as wise enough to create the opportunity for that space to be created.
Hmm.
So
Yeah,
it's
she was great. She was great, and I worked for a little while. Few years, maybe a couple years. I worked for Wave, which is now Remedies here in Rockford, and I would watch some of the clients come in, and I would think, that watching these moms parent these children in such strenuous circumstances and under dire situations. And I really, I learned, I wasn't all that wise in those years, but I learned, as I navigated life, that, that they may not always have the resources. Parents might not always have the resources, but that doesn't mean that they don't always have the love and the desire to be a parent. And I really saw that in some of the programs I worked in. Yeah.
so real quickly, if you could just remedies, which used to be Wave, is focused on what demographic did you work with at that time?
Persons fleeing domestic violence. I actually worked at the time with women who were fleeing domestic violence and had the comorbidity of substance abuse issues as well. So at the time it was connected to phase, if you'll recall.
Yeah.
And then there's a methadone clinic there as well.
Yeah. And actually, there's still Gary Hellbuck is the one who runs that program now, and they do still have the same setup. It's just under remedies now.
Under remedies now? Okay. I
Yep,
didn't know
yep,
if they still
yep,
had the phase set up. Yeah.
yeah. They still have the setup. Um, so early on, you were involved with Big Brother Big Sisters, Rockford sexual assault, um, what is now remedies. So you're working with sexual abuse, working with domestic violence and substance abuse. So these are some definitely in the trenches uh, tough situations, right? Tough circumstances to work with. Um, and then as you went and got your master's from master's in social work, you got
Yep.
your master's where?
U of I.
U of I.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Go alumni, Illini.
Yep.
Right?
Line, that's right.
Yep. And and so now, did you specialized in community mental health, right?
I sure did. Yep.
Okay.
And I started while I was working, finishing out my last year there. I began working at Rockford University. I'm
Yeah.
saying it right now,
Yeah.
because I had my internship there, and then they hired me on after I graduated, which was a blessing.
Okay.
So I was able to work under a great therapist there, and I accumulated all the hours I needed in order to get my licensure. Um, and it was from Rockford College that I went on to probably one of the most profound experiences I've had in my entire life, which was working for hospice. I started out as a bereavement coordinator, and then I finished off as a social worker for what is Heartland Hospice in Rockford, Illinois, which is a phenomenal organization. And I absolutely believe that that was one of the most profound steps I could have made in my social work career.
So two questions with that. First, for some listeners that may not fully grasp, because it was only until the last few years that I fully grasped hospice. I thought it was I had a much more limited perspective about what hospice is. So maybe tell our listeners just a little bit about what hospice. First, tell us what hospice is and the totality of what hospice can do.
Hmm. Hospice is an agency that comes in. So typically, when someone is showing signs of a declination that would lend toward a diagnosis with a prognosis of 6 months or less, right? So it's an end stage diagnosis typically with a prognosis of 6 months or less. Um, Individuals are able to partake of a hospice care, and they can do that under the Medicare hospice benefits. So it's a virtual right by all people who contributed to our gross national product, right? So whoever worked, whoever paid taxes, whoever is able to partake of those services, they do so as being a citizen of this country, and working hard for that right. It's a benefit provided to them. Now, hospice comes in, years ago, hospice used to mean, something very different. Like you had to have one foot in and one foot out kind of thing, but that's not what it means anymore. And, and so hospice now means that people like myself, I no longer work for hospice, but I teach hospice social work now. Um, but those social workers and nurses and CNAs and dietitians and music therapists and pet therapists and any physicians, anyone in the team can come and provide services to a patient, whether they're in their home or in another facility during their end of life, so that that patient may have a higher quality of life for the time that they have left. And it's not just them; it's a total spectrum of care. So they also care for the families, and it's something so special. And I know that there's sometimes it's difficult, when people say, "Oh, who did you used to work for?" And I would say, "Oh, I worked for hospice," and you'd get the reaction, "Oh," immediately people have this, "Oh, you did
Yeah, yeah.
that." But it was an honor, honestly. It was an honor, and it actually took a lot for me to leave,
Mhm.
ultimately. But it was an honor, still to this day, something I hold very near and dear to me.
Well, you had mentioned that that was one of your profound experiences. So maybe kind of give us just a little bit of a taste of what was so. You described it well about what it is, but what was one of those things that was kind of moving and profound for you?
I had never witnessed someone dying before, and I was really nervous about that. And the nurses, and social workers and chaplains and all of them who helped to train me and rear me, really helped me through that. And when it came to my first call, where I had to respond to someone and their family because this person was dying, I was so nervous driving there. But I remember when I got there, some some peace came over me as I was I'll never forget it. And I was walking into the home, and I actually met the nurse there, and we walked in together. And I really won't ever forget this. And she looked at me and she said, "Are you ready?" And I said, "Yes, I'm ready." And immediately when I went in, it was it was almost as if, I was no longer affected by the idea that someone was dying. I was more profoundly affected by, how can I care for this family and these loved ones and this person for as long as how can I extend the bandwidth of this feeling, of this notion, of this person's life and this family's experience for them? How can I do that so that I can somehow benefit them? It was a complete self-sacrifice. Whatever whatever you need. I'll do whatever it is that you need. And I found myself, you know, doing all kinds of errands for patients and their families. I found myself working beyond the hours of on call, to the extent that I learned boundaries really well. But you know, really touching base with people and wanting to make a difference in people's lives. Um, and then just getting to sit in that space with someone who you know isn't going to be here very long, and to feel their presence in the world, and to give validation to them that their words mean something, that their actions mean something. Um, you know, for the day is long, they could, you know, recite stories over and over to their families, things that they've heard 1,000 times, and get rolled eyes. But with me, I was always engaged, and I wanted to learn, and I didn't care how many times they told me, or whatever it was that they wanted read to them. I would scribe letters for people who wanted to leave letters to loved ones. I would try to create a connection with resources in the community so that people could mold their hands together.
Mm.
Um, so it became so much more about living than it ever did or ever was about dying.
Nice. Okay. All right. And I think there are such misconceptions and these perceptions based upon or you know, we have these projections about how uh, the death. We have this fear of death, and just as I was thinking, as you were just talking, I'm thinking about how we celebrate when a baby's born, and we have all these people come into the house, you know, come into the house, you know, not hospital typically, but house, and all these things after the baby's born, and we have this celebration of life. But the way that you just described the last days of someone's life is like you were experiencing and celebrating their life at the other end of the circle,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And that must have been, obviously was a really powerful a powerful opportunity. I know
Mm-hmm.
you went on and got your master's at U of I, and then you've worked at hospice, and then you've been working, did some private practice, and now you've been at KP now
Yes.
for 7 years,
Yes. Yeah.
and
Yep.
um, and in the midst of that, you went and got your doctorate, and
In all my free time.
yeah, yeah. Well, while Ember was, you know, I don't clearly was on your hip, but maybe even smaller than that, if I remember correctly. Um, and so while you have a full caseload at KP, you also are teaching at Aurora University, and you have taught at Rockford University as well.
Yes.
Um, loved by many of your students, including my son, who who had the opportunity to take whatever classes you were teaching over at RU. But one of the things I wanted to I wanted to ask you specifically about was um, similar to what you were just saying. One, I want to ask you about palliative care, and what does that mean? And maybe why don't we start there? Why don't you start? What is palliative care? From when someone has is asking or now has palliative care services, what does that really mean? Can you,
Palliative care and hospice care really go hand in hand. Palliative care means that they could still be receiving treatment, life-sustaining treatment. And in some cases, in hospice care, they can also, I apologize, I'm getting a text. They also can do some sustaining treatments, but it's not typical. So most often, once you decide on palliative care, it's comfort care at its finest. It's still the same kind of love and compassion that some compassionate care that someone is able to give you and provide to you, albeit it's done sometimes in a clinic setting and at home setting. It's done in a facility setting, and then the transition to hospice is very smooth. So it really kind of sets the stage for something like that. But they really work hand in hand with one another. Mhm.
okay. So right now, I mean, in the midst of something that most of us have never seen before with the COVID COVID-19 pandemic happening. I wanted to ask and have our listeners kind of get a perspective, because some of our listeners are directly affected by what I'm going to talk about, and others don't. They've only heard about it. When it comes to someone who's either terminal or someone who's in the hospital, maybe it's via, like, let's say, a cancer or some type of long-term illness, um, or end of life. Right now, because of the restrictions we have, family members aren't able to be with them. So if you can give us a little bit of kind of your perspective and insight. I mean, this isn't like it's not like the family's choice, and it's not like the patient's choice. If you just share maybe a little bit of insight of what that might be like, not only from the client perspective, the patient's perspective, but then also from the family members and friends.
Okay. You know, I will start with this. In my years since working as a social worker and a bereavement coordinator in hospice, I was blessed with given the opportunity to teach at Aurora University, also Rockford University, and George Williams um, College. I um, enjoyed the experience so much, and so I stayed very connected to the hospice field, also the oncology field. So when COVID-19 occurred, and on the onset of that, I learned that several students' families, um, in addition to past students and clients, um, and friends and family, were experiencing great grief, being disconnected or disengaged from their loved one who was either inpatient, receiving palliative or hospice care, end of life care, or they're receiving treatments, cancer treatments. Um, and they've been, sort of regulated to stay outside, to drop that person off, to only allow them to the door, um, and and then also when they're going in for a procedure that they're not able to accompany them, as would be in a normal kind of circumstance, under normal circumstances. And so I am, I'm really understanding more today of how radically different um, this this period has been for those individuals who are experiencing this. Something like this virus has dramatically changed and altered the pattern with which maybe we used to grieve or experience anticipatory grief, and then grief, post death. And I think that we're going to see this change unfold. I think it's ever changing. Um, and I think it's very hard to hear how a person can be so far from a loved one, knowing that they're dying, or knowing that they're not able to be close to them when they're in pain or they're suffering. And the enormous amount of work our beautiful medical professionals are doing to try to keep them connected.
Mhm.
The stories that we're hearing about loved ones dying while on FaceTime with families,
Mhm.
it just breaks my heart. So I am I'm seeing it firsthand, hearing about it, and then also experiencing it through my own clients and their families, and watching what they're going through. And it's just it's just so hard to hear. It really is.
Yeah, I can't even, in both ends, both perspectives. I can't even imagine um, being able, if that sense of feeling alone, if I was in that position of dying and no one could be there, that part, and that vacancy, and especially if there's fear or that pain that is happening, and and I and I think maybe. Of the two, I think for myself, I would probably would rather be in that position than the one of not being able to be there, um, because I think almost there'd be a greater sense of powerlessness
Mhm.
if I was the family member of someone who was terminal,
Mhm.
and I couldn't. You're already feeling powerless, so that you can't do anything, um, and now all these other restrictions are being placed, and restraints, and then I'm thinking of all the, like I have a client right now that, you know, the fear and the projections of the person being by themselves. And so um, I, I, I don't know for sure which way is which. I don't think there's a worse. I think they're both not good. Um, and,
It's so
and
complex. It's so complex.
yeah, yeah. And so if, you know, I know Delinda was on, you know, a couple of weeks ago, and she talked a little bit about the grieving process in general. And in this particular case, any of your own thoughts regarding how um, the grieving of going into this, there's like two different grievings, right? The grieving of someone being terminal and they're, you know, involved with palliative care or end of life care, and then obviously after the death there's another grieving that happens as well. So maybe you can touch a little bit on that, and maybe from both from the patient as well as the significant others of the patient.
Okay. And I also want to make a quick point, because I think you made a great point there about powerlessness. You know, for years, you think back to patients' rights, the Bill of Rights, right? And how we have, over the years, impressed upon the patient their ability to say what it is that they want,
Mhm.
their ability to have power in that moment, and the idea that they get to decide how they want to die. They get to decide who they want around them. They get to decide if they want to be at home, or if they want to be in a hospital, or if they want, you know, 5 people in the room, or if they want 50 in the room. We have coached them for years that it is their right to die how they wish to die. And now, with the restrictions in place, we are taking that from them. And I get it, believe me, I understand. But in doing so, we are removing that power that we fought so hard for them to receive for so long. And so, or we're compromising that power. And I know that it's to keep others safe, but it removes their, you know, there's a sense of loss there for them in terms of, you know, this loss of stability, this loss of sense of self. And you think about all the things that a patient might be going through in those final moments. The idea that all modesty is out the window, right? So they're just sort of there, and they're poked and they're prodded, and they're given medicine, and you know, it's a very medical motto kind of world in the hospital, in the clinic setting, or in a facility setting. And so the nurses and the CNAs, they likely do a wonderful job of trying to make it comfortable for them. But as good as they are, and as amazing as they work at it, they're not family, and they're not the loved ones, which they so need, you know? So the grief, what you're talking about in terms of two kinds of grief, when someone is approaching that time and space in their life, they can have what's called anticipatory grief, and they work through that. Patients and families will both work through that. Now, afterwards, this grief that takes place with them is strong, and for the family members, we're seeing now, only because I have experience with it now, this disconnect. You know, if you think about the different rituals that families display after someone, or even before someone dies and then after, you know, I think about my Jewish friends who are not allowed to sit Shiva, which is very important to their faith. I think about my Catholic friends, where burial is extremely important to them. The idea of visitations and celebrations and mass and you know, church outings or blessings, or these things are not happening. And so the process of grief is stifled. It's stifled because they're not able to traverse. You know, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, wonderful, developed those 5 stages. We now know that you don't typically have to navigate the stages in order, right? But the way that someone grieves is completely thrown off. It's dramatically changed because of the current circumstances. And so it is so important that we, as a clinical field, we help the loved ones after they've lost their loved one. We help the family and the friends and the coworkers and you know, whoever solicits us. We help them as best as we can to approach their grief in a way that still connects them to the person they lost. That's so important. And then prior to that patient losing their life, to offer them and to be there for them as much as we are able to, even through this sort of medium, to be able to see them in their lives and acknowledge them and validate them and let them know that even though this external structure exists, ultimately they're still in power and they get to decide how they go. They get to choose, and restoring some of that power to them, even if it's just about a mental, right, or emotional power.
Mhm. You know, it's been interesting. I just started recently for another project I'm doing with some schools. Is started revisiting Ross's work regarding the 5 stages. Originally, death and dying, right? You know, prior to death, and then she went back and she looked at these steps not as prescriptive, as you were saying, like stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, but more of descriptive of how we just naturally go through those stages. And again, it's not checking them off, but it's describing responses to circumstances
Mm-hmm.
that were also similar to the grieving process after the significant other was had passed on. But it was also similar to grieving divorce, loss of a career, loss of a job, not being able to graduate, like a normal ceremony, those types of things. There's still this process, and I wonder if there's still the same um, descriptive stages that we go through, but now with this going on, that we may get stuck because now I can be angry at the governor or be angry at the hospital administrator or angry at somebody, and then I get stuck there for maybe a longer period of time because it's always easier to be angry than sad. It's easier to fix on somebody being the villain of why I couldn't and how this was unjust. So I think it is I think it is exactly what we said. It's this opportunity that we, as Delinda said a week ago, we have to companion people through this,
Yes, absolutely.
and be able to walk them through and be able to feel the feelings that they're feeling as they're going through that.
What
Um,
you're describing is, it's called collateral grief. You know, this, it's also been termed as collective grief. The loss that you're talking about, and think about it, Kevin, the compounded grief. You think about someone going into the hospital and dying. You know, the anticipatory grief that they may have, their family might have, and then the loss that's experienced by that nurse or doctor, the loss then that's experienced by anyone else having any kind of interaction with that patient, then to go even further to the loss that's experienced by people who are finding out this person has passed and didn't even know it because they're not as connected as they would be otherwise.
right.
So much compound grief. Now, on top of that, the spouse or the loved one or the family member might have just lost their job.
Mhm.
They might be in a situation where they're not financially stable. This compounded loss only makes the grief more complex, and it complicates it to the extent that they're not able to navigate the process as they might have been able to otherwise.
Yeah, no, I, well, I know that with a couple of circumstances that we've worked with collectively or collaboratively, in situations where that was compounded, and it's one of the benefits of technology and social media, that there's been a way of, for some people, stay connected, but because not everyone is involved with social media, um, like you said, if I don't, I may, the person in the cubicle next to me is, someone may die because we're not working next to each other anymore. Um, I may not know about that, but I would have for sure walked through them with it if we were working side by side.
Yeah.
So, Christina, I thank you very much for being on the show and being able to share just a little bit about this process. And I know that the clients that you work with and the people that you touch, either as students or in the community when you're teaching, or just the clients that come to your office, I know it is a real gift that they get to work with you, and get to learn from you, as well as get to experience you walking with them um, through their hardship and pain. If there was something that you would want to share with the listeners as we wrap up for this episode, what would you want to share?
Mm. You know, I would say that never estimate the value or the power of a moment, that everything matters. We say this a lot in social work, love Brene Brown. Everybody says this now. Everything matters. Every feeling matters. Every thought matters. Every single step you take matters. And I would say that it's really important during a time like this that we just go right back to basics and really place value at every point in our life that we can, because it makes it worthwhile at the end of the day. And it creates a world where you don't have regrets, you don't have resentment, you don't get yourself all caught up in whatever is being said with social media or whatever is being said on the news. Your mind and your body go right back to what is most important, which are what you love and knowing whom you love and being near the people that mean the most to you. And that's really it. You know,
Perfect.
if I could say one more thing,
Sure. Yeah.
there was a TED talk years ago. I can't remember how many years now, but it was um, an EMS guy. He had done some research, and he created this journal that he took on the calls with him for a year. And what he wanted to record was what people's thoughts were at the end of their lives, right? So you can imagine the different accidents he'd come upon. And I can't remember his name, but I'm sure if you or your listeners Google it, they'll find it. And he said that the number one answer, which was, of course, so profound, but exactly what I thought it would be, was that people said to him time and time again over the course of that year, I want my family to know that I love them.
Mm.
Please tell my husband I love him. Please tell my daughter I love her. Please tell. And it was over and over and over again. And he said that what he realized most in doing his research was that when it got right down to it, life is about relationships.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that is one of many things that are going to be the benefit that comes out of this chaos and this darkness, is that we've been able to have an opportunity to slow down, have the opportunity in the sheltering process to focus on those relationships, and the value of them. And I think that is one of my wishes and one of my hopes, that as we come back into a new reorder of this disorder, that we're able to remember that and not let life get so busy that we somehow go back to the way it was.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I agree.
Christina, thank you very much for
Yeah.
coming on the show, and I appreciate you just being part of KP and part of my life. So I appreciate everything you do, and you have a great night. Just want to thank everyone for listening. As Christina had mentioned, this is the end of life is difficult anyways, but even more so right now are the complications of the restrictions, of the hospitals, of the clinics, of different aspects that may be restricting not only the patient but the loved ones and the family members. So as we are able to navigate through that time period, to be able to reach out to those individuals during that part of the journey, it is always difficult. But right now, with some of the constraints, it's even a little bit more so, and that complicates that grieving process afterwards. Again, thank you for being with us, and look forward to being with you soon.